Good afternoon, everyone. I, Shifali Rawat Agarwal, Ehsaas Woman of Calcutta, warmly welcome you to yet another beautiful literary session under the auspice of an Author's Afternoon in Calcutta, city of joy that takes pride in literary discussions. Prabha Khaitan Foundation, in association with its distinguished associate Taj Bengal and Ehsaas Woman of Calcutta, is excited to have a cherishing rendezvous with a former diplomat, Mr. Navdeep Suri, who has been an integral part of India's several diplomatic missions. Mr. Navdeep Suri will engage in a one-to-one conversation with Mr. Manoj Mohanka. Before the evening proceeds, allow me to say a few words about Prabha Khaitan Foundation. Prabha Khaitan Foundation is a Calcutta-based non-profit trust founded by an eminent Indian literature entrepreneur, philanthropist, social activist, and feminist late Dr. Prabha Khaitan. The essence of the foundation is the soulful association of the multicultural diversities of India. The philosophy of unity in diversity has been inspiring Prabha Khaitan Foundation to create boutique initiatives and activities that showcase the priceless literary and cultural assets of India for the past 4 decades. The Foundation's appreciable literary and cultural initiatives enjoy a global identity and niche audience. Besides promoting literature, the Foundation celebrates the jeweled cultural heritage of India, creating the finest experiences and cultural landmarks on the global map. The Foundation aims to inspire and widen the reach and the readership of English literature to literary enthusiasts worldwide. Out of the stellar literary initiatives, an Author's Afternoon holds a unique place as a series of enchanting afternoons dedicated to English literature. The Foundation has an active presence in more than 40 cities in India and overseas. It enjoys the patronage of Sri Cement Limited and is ably assisted by distinguished associates, partners, and Ehsaas Women of India in its effort to create cultural capital. It's an honor for me to welcome and introduce Mr. Navdeep Suri and conversationalist Mr. Manoj Mohanka. Mr. Navdeep Suri is a former diplomat who completed glorious 36 years in Indian Foreign Service, having served in several Indian diplomatic missions in Washington, D.C., London, Cairo, Damascus, and Dar es Salaam. He has also headed the West Africa and Public Diplomacy departments at the Ministry of External Affairs. He was India's High Commissioner to Australia and Ambassador to Egypt and UAE. He has been conferred with Order of Zayed II by the President of UAE as a rare gesture. His innovative ideas on the use of social media in public democracy have fetched him global recognition, appreciation, and awards. Mr. Suri is an extensively learned person. He holds a master's degree in economics. He has a command over Arabic and French languages. The prolific power of his pen is unparalleled. He has written on India's Africa policy and on the Middle East and Indo-Pacific, on public diplomacy and on the IT outsourcing industry. He has also co-edited the ORF Global Policy Book, a vision for India's economic diplomacy. Mr. Suri has been a keen enthusiast to preserve the literary legacy of his grandfather, the legendary Punjabi novelist, poet, and songwriter Nanak Singh. His mission has been to bring his grandfather's work to the purview of a wider global audience, and for this he exercises the power of his pen. He has translated his grandfather's classic Punjabi novels that include Pavitra Papi and Ad Kidya Fool, pardon me for the pronunciation, and also the translation of Singh's lost poem, Khuni Vaishakhi. His latest book is the translation of Nanak Singh's Punjabi novel, Khoon De Sohile, translated into English as Hymns in Blood. Mr. Suri wears many hats. He is Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Center of New Economic Diplomacy at the Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. He is an advisor to several prestigious international organizations and an independent director on the board of reputed companies. He is also the Professor of Eminence at Guru Nanak Dev University at Amritsar. Conversationalist Manoj Mohanka is a businessman and serial entrepreneur, but he's far more interested in the affairs of the state and the state of affairs. He follows politics and religion closely, runs a trust to educate Muslim girls from underprivileged families, and writes when he feels strongly, which is often. Let's get the event started without further delay. Over to you, Mr. Mohanka.
Thank you for that generous introduction. You'll pardon me, but one correction, not on the pronunciation, but there is no former diplomat. Once a diplomat, always a diplomat.
Career diplomat.
That's true.
It's about a career diplomat.
I hope to prove wrong.
Career diplomat.
So right now the entire country is agog with Rishi Sunak, an ethnic Indian who has become Prime Minister of UK. And I think this is the first time where there is, other than perhaps Kashmir and the Kohinoor, there is ownership dispute on his origin. If some of you follow Pakistani news, Geo in particular, they have claimed ownership since his grandparents originated from the Punjab as well. Incidentally, very close to the same village from where Dr. Manmohan Singh hailed. So having said that, Navdeep bhai, what do you think the chances are for an ethnic Indian to become Prime Minister of Australia?
Well, first of all, Shivani, thank you very much, and pleasure to be here, and thank you to the Prabha Khaitan Foundation. I think at least 2 generations away. And the reason I say is that there's a natural process of evolution. I've seen the Indian diaspora fairly closely in UK, in US, and in Australia. Also in South Africa, but that's a different kind of diaspora to a certain extent. But in the UK, if you see the bulk of the Indian migration happening in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and what you're seeing is second or third generation persons who are occupying positions of power. And that's reflected in the number of members of parliament, councillors, etc., etc. And that, in a sense, leads to the point where, although I still think it's a quirk of circumstances that Rishi Sunak is Prime Minister, but we'll let that pass. I think in Australia, on your specific question, it's only in the last 10 years or even less that the volumes of migration have picked up to a point that you will start getting that critical mass in certain areas. And it takes any community a couple of generations before they can have the luxury of moving beyond living hand to mouth and eking out a living to getting an education into that system and then being confident enough, and it really is a question of confidence, enough to be able to participate in political life. So I think we're talking about 40 years or so. You wanted to give a date or?
It's going to be after my lifetime in that case, but we do hope that it will be in our lifetime. And what do you make of Pakistan's claim for ownership?
Sour grapes? I think, it'll be nice if they started paying respect to Indus Valley civilization as a starting point. It'll be nice if they start recognizing the shared common history, heritage, and culture, and not live in this fantasy of a post-1947 creation, where, for the first 3 or 4 decades, there was almost this attempt to create a country that seeks affinity with the Gulf and with the Arab world, and almost even the language Urdu was being Arabized to the detriment of many. So I think they need to start feeling a little comfortable in their own skin before we can give any credence to these kind of claims.
So we'll circle back to this in just a bit, because you made an observation to which I'd react by saying, and then perhaps not not politically correct to say, but even a large section of the Indian Muslims claim their origin to be Arab or Iranian rather than Indians who, over a period of time, converted to Islam for a variety of reasons. So it's in the same context that I'd see an analogy in what it is that you're saying.
You know, I was reading this book recently about the princes of Deccan. And the fact is that during the 17th and 18th centuries, many of the ruling dynasties drew a direct connection to then Persia. So the level of influence of the Iranian side of thing at that point of time in that geography, and I think we just need to be careful that we don't conflate Muslims from Kashmir to Kanyakumari in one, because there is so much diversity.
Sure. I get the point, but I was only reflecting on what it is you said in terms of
he denied recently when we were having coffee that he's a journalist, but there's a journalist lurking deep down. You can tell from the provocative questions.
It's also because I have a role model in my life to emulate. All of you here know Payal is a well-known journalist.
Yeah.
So there's always this catch-up thing that I admit to. So there have been several seminal works or novels based on partition. In Hindi, we had Tamas, which was also made into a film. There's one by Mumtaz Shah Nawaz, which unfortunately is out of print in English, called The Heart Divided. I don't know if you've had occasion to read that. Train to Pakistan by Kushwant Singh. There's one by Elias in Bengali on Bangladesh and West Bengal in terms of the base being partition and the socio-political events. In Urdu, there is Hussein's Udas Nasle, which I think is an absolute masterpiece. I've read some or all of those over the years, and it was providence that our dear friend Herman took unwell, and I wish him speedy recovery, not to misunderstand, but it is that which gave me the opportunity to read Hymns in Blood, which was originally written by venerated Nanak Singh in Gurmukhi, and would not have reached an audience such as ours. Certainly, for me, the language is not something I would read, despite being married to a Sikhni. So we need to, and I went through it yesterday over a few hours. It's Navdeep has not translated it, but he has actually got the soul and spirit of what the author meant. And I really commend this book to anyone here who wishes to have a deeper understanding of what partition actually meant, both the events prior and subsequent. And in a way, the story is woven seamlessly. So it's an absolute must read. And then while we discuss this book subsequently, Navdeep, the turning point in your grandfather's life, who's one of the most respected authors in Gurmukhi, having written at least 38 novels, if I'm not wrong, which are part of college education as well at both the undergrad and university level. So the turning point really was for him to have personally witnessed Jallianwala Bagh and survived. Would you elaborate on that for us?
Sure. If, with your permission, just a little bit about my grandfather, because he's really quite a remarkable person. He was born in the Jhelum district in what is now Pakistan, in a fairly poor family. When he was about 9 years old, his father used to have a little kirana shop in Peshawar. So he was asked to come and help his father in the shop. And a year later, when he was 10, his father passed away. And so he, as a 10-year-old, was left to fend for his family, look after an ailing mother and 2 siblings. And so when people used to ask him, how much did you study? How well educated are you? And he'd say, well, I find it hard to answer because I don't know whether I'm 4th pass or 5th failed. And I say this because more recently we were setting up a Nanak Singh Center at the Guru Nanak University Library, and we started collecting material about him. And there are over 70 master's and PhD dissertations on his work. So for somebody who had no formal education, that's quite formidable. But he was born as Hansraj in a Hindu family. He was struggling to figure out a life for himself. He was 15 or 16. He was in Peshawar. And as he says in his autobiography, he fell into bad company. And that's when he came under the influence of this very pious Sikh priest at the Gurdwara in Peshawar. And under his influence, he converted to Sikhism, and from Hansraj became Nanak Singh. And with the zeal of the new convert, as they say. One of the first things was he had a talent for music, he had a penchant for verse. And he proceeds to write a book of verses or songs in praise of the Sikh gurus. And the book is called Satgur Mehman, and it was first published in 1918. And it's fascinating because every hymn is written, he mentions the tune and the tal and the rag for that. So it is in the tune of popular songs of that period. And we are actually trying to recreate some of that 100 years and a bit later. But so 1918, he suddenly became famous because of Satgur Mehma, and it sold in lakhs of copies at that time. And it became his financial sustenance. So 1990 now, he's in Amritsar, goes to Jallianwala Bagh with 2 of his friends to protest against the Rowlatt Act. And the firing happens, and both his friends are killed in the firing. He himself is knocked unconscious in the stampede that ensues, is left among the dead, as we heard it from my grandmother, that it's literally like he was amongst the corpses, and walks away from there. And once he's recovered, he writes this searing long poem called Khuni Vaisakhi. And it's first published in May 1920, immediately banned by the Brits, all copies confiscated. And for the next 60 years, nobody's seen it. It's lost, as Shifali mentioned, it's lost poem. And there's just a passing reference to it in his own autobiography. Until in 1979, out of a series of bizarre circumstances, we get our hands on a copy, and my father republishes it, and then I had the honor to translate it to commemorate with the centenary of the massacre in 2019.
So would you oblige us by reading a paragraph or 2?
So, let me read one very small part from the opening, the very first page, because it is almost like this 22-year-old at that time had a sense that he's writing this poem for posterity. And that I find that fascinating, that which 22-year-old thinks that way. But it starts with an invocation to Guru Gobind Singh. And it says, "O Father mine, with thy turban plumed, I bow at thy feet, my divine Guru, Messiah of the meek, Savior of the poor, my divine Guru." And he goes on to say, "Let my pen fly across the pages to tell this tale, my divine Guru, of innocent souls laying down their lives for our nation's sake, my divine Guru. To pen a portrait of those departed ones, grant me the strength, my divine Guru, to remind my people across India, lest we forget their sacrifice, my divine Guru. To write the saga of our heroes such, your disciple is ready, my divine Guru. Do help me complete this mission of mine. Nanak Singh beseeches, O my divine Guru. So it's like he had this thing that he's writing, and just to complete the thought on this, Manoj, so the poem is almost a chronological account of that traumatic first fortnight of April 1919. It beautifully captures the mood of the city from the time that the Rowlatt Act is brought into force. And let's not forget that Gandhiji gave a call for Satyagraha, April 6, to protest against the act. He was on his way to Punjab, and he was.
And this was 13th April, if I recall.
It was on the 13th April. And so he really brings out the mood of the city and how it builds up, and then the aftermath of the massacre itself. I'll just read one passage because I think it's so visual and perhaps even a bit graphic. And of course, with the usual caveat that much is lost in translation. So, I don't think any translation really captures the power of the original.
But you have the genes flowing, so we assume.
Thank you.
And the 12-year overlap influence, right? You saw him for the first 12 years of your life, so there's something must have rubbed out for sure.
I hope so. 5:30 sharp, the clock had struck. Thousands gathered in the Bagh, my friend. Leaders came to lament the nation's woes, taking turns to speak out loud, my friend. Voice grievance, hardship, anger, sorrow, saying no one listens to us, my friends. What can we do? What options left? Can't see any ray of light, my friends. Those words forlorn, they barely voiced, came soldiers thundering down, my friends. At Dyer's command, those Gurkha troops gathered in a formation tight, my friends. Under tyrants' orders, they opened fire straight into innocent hearts, my friends. And fire and fire and fire they did. Some thousands of bullets were shot, my friends. Like searing hail, they felled our youth, a tempest not seen before, my friends. Riddled chests and bodies slid to the ground, each one a target large, my friends. Haunting cries for help did rend the sky. Smoke rose from smoldering guns, my friends. Just a sip of water was all they sought. Valiant youth lay dying in the dust, my friends. That narrow lane to enter the Bagh, sealed off on Dyer's command, my friends. No exit, no escape, no way out was left, making Bagh a deathly trap, my friends. A fortunate few somehow survived, while most died then and there, my friends. Some ran with bullets ripping their chest, stumbling to their painful end, my friends. Others caught the bullet while running away, dropping lifeless in awkward heaps, my friends. In minutes the bags were strewn with corpses. None knew just who was who, my friends. Many of them did look like Sikhs. Amid Hindus and Muslims, plenty, my friends. In prime of their youth, our brave hearts lay, gasping for one last breath, my friends. Long hair lay matted in blood and grime. In slumber deep they sleep, my friends.
Oh, wow.
Says Nanak Singh, who knows their state, but God, the one and only, my friends.
Moving, extremely moving indeed. So one observation on this, it's very, very clear that the protests, right from the Rowlatt Act, or even before and after, was a combined community of all Indians against the British. What is it that changed? And this is clearly enunciated in Nanak Singh Ji's poem as well. So what is it that transpired from and if you read the foreword, right, he clearly says on page 9, in one short year, right, everything changed. So if we look at D-Day as being Direct Action Day, 16th August 1946 as the turning point, and then you have Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs baying for each other's blood. What do you think? What do you think happened for this entire radical, unfortunate transformation?
Yeah, I'll just take one quick aside and then come. Before Jallianwala Bagh, April 10 happened, 9th was Ram Navami. And this was a festival that was celebrated in a remarkable show of unity by the Sikh, Hindu and Muslim communities of the city. And in fact, later during the Hunter Commission of Inquiry, which was appointed to look into the massacre, the then Deputy Commissioner of Amritsar, Miles Irving, says that he found it sinister that the communities had buried their differences and were acting with such fraternity towards each other. And so the two leaders of Amritsar at that time were Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal. And both are arrested on the 10th of April. And so the people of Amritsar go to the Deputy Commissioner's office to protest, and there's firing again. This is on 3 days before the massacre happened, and a lot of people have forgotten this part of the history where about 30 people died 3 days before April 13. And I just wanted to read a short piece, and then I'll be done with this, simply because I think on the question that you put, it's so evocative, that he says, he's describing the scene in Amritsar on April 11. The firing has happened on April 10th, and people are taking the dead to the graveyard. They struggled, drenched in anger and tears, distraught they truly were, my friends, carried corpses on their shoulders bent, limped back to their city sad, my friends. Hall Bazaar's mosque was the night's abode, for dead bodies placed in rows, my friends, heaved up next morning and off once again to Sultanwind's graveyard large, my friends. Funeral processions joined by thousands more walked angrily, dazed and distraught, my friends. Hindu, Sikh and Muslim strode side by side, hearts pierced by arrows sharp, my friends. The same grief and pain they shared, each bound by sorrow's same, my friends. Then a sight most wondrous was seen, it left us amazed and awed, my friends. Ya Hussain, cried out the Hindus and Sikhs, as Muslims echoed Ram Ram, my friends. And thus they reached graveyard together, Hindu, Muslim and also the Sikh, my friends. Funeral pyres flamed for Hindus and Sikhs, with Muslims buried alongside, my friends. So, that's the mood of the city that he captures. On your own point, so if I set myself aside and just look at what the books are saying, in his foreword, my grandfather puts the blame in one part very squarely on Jinnah and on the Muslim League. For ramping up the whole demand for Pakistan. But he also says something else. And he does put a certain amount of blame on the Brits for applying their policy of divide and rule. But he goes a step beyond, and he doesn't want us to take the easy way out and saying, it's the Brits who did it, or the Muslim League who did it. He says, what happened to us? We lived together for generations. What made us go at each other's throats? What made us lose our humanity the way he did? And in his foreword, there's a very powerful line, a controversial line, and which is one reason I picked up this book. I thought that at a time when we are celebrating Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, it's worth remembering some of this stuff from 75 years ago. He says, and the reason it's important is that this book was published in February 1948. So the timelines kind of are important. And he says, at this point, when India, after 200 years of being colonized, is celebrating its independence, anybody who knows me knows I have every breath of my body has been for India's independence. And yet, today I have to step back and ask, was it worth it? Was it worth getting our independence and losing our humanity? And he wants us to take ownership also, not just blame somebody else. That what happened to us? How could we get swayed into going at each other's throats with such brutality that it left hundreds of thousands dead? And one of the messages that comes across, I think, is beware the leaders who will arouse communal passions, because you don't know where that inferno is going to take you and leave everybody singed.
So, I'll continue being the journalist for one last question, and then we'll open it to everyone for discussion. And you'll pardon me this question of Deepa. On page 11, Nanak Singh Ji quotes Iqbal, right? And he says, "Sare jahan se acha," and this is a poem that
All of us know.
All of us know, and Iqbal wrote in 1904. This book was written in 1948, right? Well after Iqbal's 1910 poem, where he changed Sare Jahan Se Acha into a different meaning and context altogether. I'll read those lines. It's called Tarane Milli, and it says, "Sino Arab Hamara, Hindustan Hamara, Muslim hai hum, Watan hai Sara Jahan Hamara." And this was the turning point in Iqbal's thought process, and we all know what he did in 1930 at the Muslim League conference, etc., etc. So the simple point that I'm making is, why would Nanak Singh Ji, who was, politically completely aware, and write such a moving book? In particular, I've had the privilege of reading only this one. Why would he look at only one aspect when he's highlighting something or a point that he's making, and not cover the other aspect of the same individual?
The honest answer is I don't know. But you've set my mind on it, and I will dig a little deeper, because in the sequel to this book, and these were two novels that he wrote back to back, so there's a sequel coming up as well. There's a character in this book, Naseem, who reappears in the second book, and she's talking about her fondness for literature, and again she talks about 3 or 4 figures whose writings or poetry have influenced her, and Iqbal is one of them. So I will certainly probe a little deeper into this.
Since you've answered it so diplomatically.
No, I don't know.
And
it's a legitimate answer, right? I don't know.
And so very kindly, without getting angry at me, I'll circle back to some more journalistic questions as we go along. But I'd like at this stage, I think we are 30 minutes in. I'd like to open the floor to anyone who might wish to ask.
You have the script with you, so you're translating, but did you have to do any research?
Yes, I do research, because as a translator, you want to get a lot of stuff right. If there are names mentioned, you want to get those names right. If there are dates mentioned, sometimes, as he has just pointed out, you also want to check whether your grandfather got the facts right. And this was particularly, look, why should I assume, that whatever he said was the gospel truth? Like when I was researching for Khundi Vaisakhi, I didn't know too much about the history of Jallianwala Bagh, or the backstory of it, or the angst after the First World War ended, and how Punjab, having contributed 500,000 troops to the war effort, felt so betrayed by, and that's why people were angry at the time of the Ral attack. So there was a lot of stuff that I wanted to research about the First World War, about the details of the Rowlatt Act, and then the circumstances of that fortnight, Ram Navami, the firing, and all of that. And what I found was, and this might be interesting from, again, that factual point of view, that 90% of what he said was accurate. Pretty much the sequence of events is exactly as he had described it, the curfews, the celebrations, the firing, the aftermath. And yet there was a major thing that happened which was not mentioned here, but which is mentioned here 28 years later, curiously. But on the 10th of April, after Saifuddin Kichlu and Satyapal were arrested, the story, as historians now tell us, is that the people of Amritsar, quite a large number, went out of the walled city, marching towards the civil lines area where the deputy commissioner and others, they wanted to give a petition for the release. The deputy commissioner had given orders that they will not go beyond this point, and so there was firing. And then I read out to you a portion about the burials and the funerals and all that. But there was a second story, that one portion of the mob went on a rampage in Amritsar city and burnt down the town hall, the municipality office, the Standard Bank building, Chapter Bank building, and a number of other English facilities in the city. And one of the most egregious things that happened was that there was a Scottish missionary, Marcia Sherman, if I remember correctly, who was assaulted. And all of that is conveniently or inconveniently absent. And I thought a little bit about it, that if he knew everything so well, why did he leave it out? And I think he was writing with a purpose. If one side of the narrator is telling you one side of the story, he's telling the story as he wants you to hear it. And so I said, well, maybe he's using a poet's prerogative to focus on the things that he wants to.
To use his words, Navdeep, which you have translated, a story that flows naturally between the two banks of image and reality. I think it's only fair, because in any case he sets this out to be a novel. But
yes, the point is, before I take up translation, I do end up educating myself about the period, about the geography, about the context. These days, the tools that we have available are actually much more interesting. So if there's a village called Chakri that is mentioned here, I go into Google and find out more about that place. Does it actually exist? Does, geographically, how far is it, etc., etc., just to make sense in my own head before I can translate.
So you have to go through a lot of archives and old papers and things like that?
Not as much. Once or twice, yes, but because at the end of the day I'm translating, I just need to make sure that I don't unwittingly convey wrong information. But I also have to be true to the text that I am writing. And if he has chosen to omit something, like the attack on the missionary, then I'm not going to insert it, right? I'm aware it happened.
So Navdeep, one other question on Chakri. Just one thing on Chakri. It's a village where the relationship between the communities is utopian and ideal. Right? That's how the book reflects it. And when the change begins to happen with the advent of the Munshi at the mosque and the Maulvi, the first two adherents to these are the butcher's son and the cobbler's son. That's specifically mentioned. So you could either call them lower caste or you could call them have-nots. Was your grandfather making a specific point by identifying the profession of the two individuals who were the first adherents to these two spreading sectarian violence.
The point he makes is that the rural, uneducated class of Muslims were particularly vulnerable to the Muslim League propaganda, and the Maulvis of the villages became willing instruments in the hands of that propaganda. So whether it was whether he writes about Hazara and the frontier areas, or he writes about Pothohar and Punjab itself, I think he certainly brings that aspect in. I think the fact that one happens to be a cobbler's son is probably coincidental, but just an aside. So we were talking about this book at the Nehru Center in London, and the Manoj in Nehru Center was a guy called Parvez Alam, who used to be head of BBC's Hindi service at one point of time. Parvez said what he found really fascinating about Chakri and in intercommunal relations. He said, I come from Aligarh, and we would never have imagined those kind of relationships where our grandparents were growing up. The friction or the tension was much more palpable even before independence in those areas as compared to Punjab, where the communities really lived close together. You know, as you would notice, there's a degree of ghettoization in the sense that there's a Khatri area and there is the area of the Muslim majority. But they celebrate each other's festivals, they come together a lot. So there is...
Lori, for instance, which is clear, enunciated very, very clearly in an entire chapter.
And Lodi is fascinating, there's a whole chapter devoted to Lodi, and it's actually the exact midpoint of the book, from where, even as a romantic sort of love story is developing with its all its back and forths. But there's suddenly a change of mood because they're celebrating Lodi, and one character starts talking politics, which is happening at that point of time. And it also helps you kind of fix the timelines that, yes, it is around January 1947 that in Punjab, and he traces it, that it started in Kolkata, then Noakhali, then, moved progressively westwards towards Punjab. One point, Manoj, I want to mention is that the reason these two books are interesting, from an audience's point of view, perhaps, is that while both are set in roughly the first 8 months of 1947, this one focuses entirely on life in the Pothohar area near Rawalpindi, the highlands where there was a significant Sikh and Hindu community, and their exodus towards Amritsar. The second one is set entirely in Amritsar. And, working on that in particular set me thinking. When we were growing up, Amritsar is my home. I spent my first 22 years pretty much uninterrupted in Amritsar. And we grew up in a milieu where there were no Muslims. Zero, pretty much. The only Muslims that we ever saw were the occasional Kashmiris or Afghans coming in with some trade. And then when I was doing research, as you said, the 1941 census, which was the last one conducted before partition, showed that Amritsar district had a 43% Muslim population. So it shows to you how complete the ethnic cleansing was from both sides.
Both ethnic cleansing and migration.
Yeah, and massacre.
MK,
I have a very different literary question, because normally what happens in this kind of a literature, we have reflection of those times, the actual real reflection of the society, as people lived. Like for example, people say that Gana Devata is, when you read Gana Devata, then you know how the drain of wealth affected this whole nation. So that kind of a metaphorical expressions, they keep on coming in the literature. Do you think you had problems in, because those expressions will be typically in the local lingo, and that converting and translating that local lingo with the same meaning and the same kind of at least broader sense, how do you tackle that and how do you feel about that?
A really good question, and I can tell you that there are no easy ways around it. Translation is funny because when I am translating something from Gurmukhi Punjabi written in 1947, I'm actually asking you to make a leap of imagination. Because I'm asking you to read characters speaking in English in a small village in Punjab in 1947, right? So you are, first I'm asking you to, as the reader, to make that leap of faith. Secondly, for me, when I'm translating, there are often instances where there is no direct way to tackle it. To try and explain it is to butcher it sometimes. And you can't do that much violence to the original text, because if he's a famous writer, it is because he wrote in a local style that made him so loved. So then you try to find bypasses, right? You find ways to convey the meaning without necessarily trying to translate that particular idiom. But there are limitations to this process, and one of his best novels, which is really seen in Punjabi as one of the great classics of Punjabi language, is a novel called Chitta Lahu, which he wrote in 1932. I tried my hand at translating it. I spent an immense amount of effort. After 30-35 pages, I gave up. And the reason was that the two characters which stand out in that book, one is the Granthi of the village, and he's the villain, and through his character, my grandfather was trying to say, beware of bigots and charlatans, right, who will put on a religious garb and try to fool you. But that man uses a quote from Guru Granth Sahib to justify every evil act that he does. It tells you the power of quoting out of context. Right? The other guy is the village opium addict, who's a good guy, lovable guy, but every sentence has an idiom which is so rooted into that soil. It has got something to do with the crop, the season, the harvest, the kind of thing that is going on, the pests, etc., that it doesn't lend itself. So I said, I need to evolve as a translator before I can really do any kind of justice to that. But certainly I don't have the right to destroy a classic. And you can easily over-translate and destroy. One point here is that, there are different styles of translation, right? And some very good translators make extensive use of either a glossary or footnotes, and you would have seen that. Up till now, I've tried to avoid it. And I guess maybe because I'm lazy, but I think there are possibly two better reasons than that. One is, I trust the intelligence of the reader that you will be able to figure out from the context. So I will try to give you a clue to what that is. I might add a bit, 4 or 5 words from my side in the sentence to give you a clue on what that particular word is. So if it's somebody, for example, the kuhar is a guy who carries the palanquin of the doli after a wedding. So how much should I explain a kuhar rather than just say that, there are people and allow you to get from the context that this is what I'm alluding to. The second is we now have Google Baba.
Yeah.
So if you're really interested, you can probably search it. And sometimes I do to make sure, even if I don't explain it, if the reader is really interested, yes, there is a meaning there. So I try to avoid footnotes. I think they are a distraction from the flow of the text.
So did you notice how adroitly Navdeep Bhai made a point or a dig at my expense? He praised MK's question sky high and described mine as a journalist query. So, please, ma'am.
My name is Aditi Naskar, and
too.
I'm glad to have an opportunity to have this heart-to-heart talk with you. When you were reading the text, I remembered this poet T.S. Coleridge, like when you read that poetry of his, The Rime of Ancient Mariner, and this partition kind of hangs like the albatross he talks about, whether it's for the Muslim, for the Pakistanis or Indians. It has been since 1947 onwards, I feel. And as a student of history and political science, I feel when you would translate, that impressed me a lot, But when you were translating the translations, did your perceptions as a individual guy influence the translations which you were making when you were writing?
Actually, to the contrary, I think I got influenced by the process of translation. And, I'm making a slightly delicate point here. You remember when Manoj said, forever diplomat, and I said, I intend to prove him wrong. The reason is, yes, I spent 36 years in the Indian Foreign Service, where every word had to be measured, every message that you want to give is very, very clear, etc. I think the process of and many of us carry that trait post-retirement into our lives, even though technically you are under no restraint anymore, but you get used to that, I guess, conditioned to that. I think the process of translating these two books reminded me of something, that my grandfather was writing Khuni Vaisakhi when he was 22, and there's this passage where after the massacre has been described, he says, Dyer, you are a murderer, and till the end of time you'll be remembered for the butcher that you are. Now, that's a hugely courageous thing to say at the time when the Rowlatt Act is still in force. And then when I was translating this one, he says, why am I translating this book? And somewhere he goes on to say, because I'm not a historian, but I think that when after the passage of time people translate it, they will put their own perspectives or interpretations on the events that I'm witnessing today. And he says some things, so while the first book by very nature is very strongly critical of the atrocities that the Muslims wrought on the Hindus and Sikhs because it's about their exodus. The second one that I'm now translating, there's a very powerful scene where there's arson in Amritsar, and the key character.
This is Game of Fire, RKK.
Yeah, the one that I'm working on now, A Game of Fire. The main protagonist, he hears some shouting coming from a Muslim area, very close to his house, and in Amritsar, and he thinks that because last night there was an arson in another Muslim area, this time these guys must be out on the rampage for vengeance. And so he goes towards that street, and in his mind he sees that it will be people wearing, and I didn't realize that people wore Turkish fez caps in Amritsar at that time, but he thinks it will be people wearing those caps and with daggers and with Ya Hussein on their lips, and they will be out seeking vengeance. And he's surprised that what he sees is actually a group of people wearing black turbans of Sikhs with kirpans and shouting Bole So Nihal and out for vengeance, right? It takes a lot of courage for a Sikh in Amritsar in 1947 to be saying something against the Sikhs in Amritsar. So as a result, the impact on me, I think, has been a little bit of a stiffening of the spine and rediscovering your DNA and saying, hey, if he could say those things under those circumstances, then what prevents me from speaking my mind when something bothers me deeply? And if it offends somebody, so be it.
So as it did, Navdeep, when 28th August 21, when the new Jallianwala Bagh was given to the nation, you did speak out. So would you care to share that sentiment and why you felt so strongly about the remodeled Jallianwala Bagh?
Yeah, well, firstly,
and undiplomatic language at that, if I remember your piece.
Yeah, I wrote an op-ed in the Tribune, which they carried it big on Sunday. They gave it a whole page. I called it a desecration of a sacred site. And the reason I chose those words was because of the violence that had been done to the history. Yes, the place needed better toilets and better facilities and maybe a better interpretation center, and none of that you would argue with. But when you're trying to improve a place, you don't Disneyfy it. We have had the privilege of visiting the Holocaust Museum in New York and the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. As ambassador in Egypt, I used to go every year to the Al Alamein cemetery, Commonwealth war graves, and lay a wreath there. And you soak in the sanctity of the place. That when you go there, you should be forced to pause and reflect on what happened. So my unhappiness with what was done with Jallianwala Bagh was at two levels. One is, as soon as you enter, on both sides you have murals which show happy people getting into Jallianwala Bagh. And this is the notion that the Brits also were trying to peddle, that this was Vaisakhi and a lot of people who came to Jallianwala Bagh were to celebrate Vaisakhi. Not true. Amritsar was under curfew.
Yes.
People don't go celebrating Vaisakhi when there's a curfew. This was happening after April 11, April 10, when there had already been firing and Dyer had been brought in to impose martial law. So that was the first thing, that how can you show these happy faces coming in? But the second to me, which was the most egregious, was for the sake of the tourists. You enter, and for me it came as such a shock that as we'd done our tour, and so as you enter, not only do you have the murals, but you have happy patriotic songs, "Mere Desh ki dharti sona ugle," etc. Blaring from the speakers, and clearly putting people in a celebratory sort of mood as you
rather than somber.
But what really shook me was, as I was going back out, the guard stopped me and said, "Nahi sahab, exit udhar hai." I was stunned. Jallianwala Bagh happened because there was no exit. How dare you do this? That you have actually changed not just the history, but the geography, the sense of location, sense of perspective, and an exit going out on a separate street. I think that's what it still gets me angry.
I think that that's evident. But tell me, did you happen to see the film Udham Singh? And did you see that portrayal of what transpired? Would you say it's as close as one can get to what may have happened on that fateful day?
Only in part. I think filmmakers take liberties, but filmmakers are allowed to take liberties. Manoj, there's a big difference between a filmmaker expressing something on the big screen and what you do on the ground at a national monument. And Jallianwala Bagh is, in a sense, unique. This is the place for which a trust was created. People put in money to buy the land so that a national memorial could be built. The trust is chaired by the Prime Minister of India. So there's a whole history.
Yeah, he dedicates it to the nation, if I recall correctly.
This is the milestone which forced Tagore to renounce his knighthood. Ramchandra Guha says this is the point where Gandhi turned from being a British loyalist to a staunch nationalist. Can't we? It marks actually the downhill of the British Empire when they lost the moral legitimacy to rule. So if a place is that large in our consciousness, then the least we can do is preserve it properly. So when I did this is interesting because when I was writing that piece, I said, let me talk to a few more people. Is it just I who feel this way? So because I'm from Guru Nanak University, I talked with a couple of the professors there. I talked to a couple of journalists there and others. So there are various suggestions that came about what we could have tried to do creatively. And one of the really interesting one was the Rowlatt Act was an attempt to suppress freedom of speech. These guys were out there for a peaceful protest. So why don't we create it to do something like the Hyde Park Speaker's Corner, where people can come and vent their grievances. Obviously that wouldn't fly very far.
So, I think I'm being shown the exit. So just one last thing to wrap. There's this famous saying in Punjab, and again, like Shefali, I may not get the pronunciation right. "Je Lahore nahi dekha, usne janma hi nahi."
Jinne Lahore nahi dekhi, wo jamya hi nahi.
Just right. I know I had the accent wrong. Given that Lahore and Amritsar are 40 miles apart, right, and we've had 75 years of independence, why is it that the Atari-Wagah border is still so difficult to cross? And going forward, do you see an easing of this border restriction and making life much easier for people across? Because, Payal and I were there in March, and I know how difficult it is to get a visa. There were people who were queuing up for visas at the Pakistan High Commission who had relatives who had passed away the previous week, and they were not getting visas. And from people in Pakistan, Hindus in particular in Pakistan, seeking visas to come to India, and dare I say our High Commission is not the most helpful. When do you see, given that you've been a diplomat 36 years in formal service and continue to be both diplomatic and undiplomatic, do you see an easing in the next few years, or do you see it muddling along the way it has been for the last so many?
So, three quick parts on this. First is Amritsar and Lahore really had a symbiotic relationship over the centuries. If Lahore was the political capital, Amritsar was the commercial capital, and so the partition was particularly wrenching for these two cities because they depended on each other in so many ways. A Pakistani writer wrote a beautiful piece. He said, "We always looked towards each other. Now we're being forced to look in other directions." And that's kind of tells you a lot. The second, it wasn't always difficult. When I was growing up in Amritsar in the 60s, my parents could cross over without a visa. They used to go and see cricket matches in Lahore. They would go shopping in Lahore and come back. So at one of those quirks of history, in 2005, I was told by my bosses that you've been chosen to go as the next Consul General to Karachi. This was an agreement between Musharraf and Manmohan Singh. And the consulates in Mumbai and Karachi were to be reopened after a gap of then 13 years, simultaneously on the 1st of January 2006. This was one of those intermittent periods of bonhomie that we have witnessed. So I was told, be prepared, this is the time of people-to-people contact. Be prepared, 1,500 visas a day is your initial target. Okay.
That's the number in 5 years now, right?
Guess what happened? I never went there. The consulate 17 years later is still closed because somewhere the generals changed their mind in Rawalpindi that they did not want the Indian consulate to engage in people-to-people contact in Karachi. Something similar happens on trade, right? Where it's a no-brainer that both sides would benefit from trade. Last month, after the floods in Pakistan, there was an outcry that tomatoes were at 300 rupees a kilo, whereas they were 20 rupees a kilo in Amritsar. So how easy it would be to send some trucks or even a rake across, and our farmers would probably fetch better prices. But it didn't happen. And twice, in fact, in the last 3 years, you had governments in Pakistan or prime ministers saying that let's open up trade, and it changed. So coming to your point, this is one of those unfortunate cases where it will take two to tango. I think unless Pakistan gets to a point where it's got some semblance of stability, number one. Second, it gets a government where the army and the civilian leadership sing from the same hymn sheet. Unless that happens, you can have a Nawaz Sharif come and say that let's improve relations with India, but a General Bajwa saying, how dare you do this without us consulting us, right? So, unless both those conditions are met, you have a stable government in Pakistan and you have an alignment between the civilian and military leadership. And then, yes, is India willing to respond? My own sense is that India would respond if it sees merit. That we do see this as a monkey on our back. This whole thing with Pakistan, but we cannot do anything about it until they get their house in order. The final interesting thing on this is, again, partly researching this book, having conversations with people, I came across this paradox, which I thought I'd share with you. That if there is one part of this great country which paid a real price for independence and partition, that is Punjab, and Bengal, of course. But Bengal was by an order of magnitude lower than what happened in Punjab, in the scale of brutality that.
Might I just say one thing, Navdeep, just on this, on the scale of brutality, my own sense from my reading is that it has been grossly underreported in Bengal. People chose to sweep it under the carpet rather than share their wound of pain in the open. But that's my
sure. But what I wanted to say was, the paradox is that if there's one place in the country where there's a peace constituency today, that's Punjab. And across my friends and others, there's a yearning for peace. The point that you make, for you it's going from Kolkata. Look at the guys living there who can't go. I have friends who travel across the world but who've never been to Pakistan. So that's the paradox, that how is it that a people who suffered in 47, then in the 71 war, when I remember army camping in our village and all of that, 65 and 71, both wars largely to an extent fought on the Punjab border and then on in Jammu and all, seem to be willing to get over it, but the rest of the country isn't. So that's something I leave for you to reflect in an editorial maybe at some point.
Thank you. So I've been shown the exit door not once but thrice.
Okay.
So I'll thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your time. It's been a privilege. It's been an honor. And above all, thank you for introducing me to Nanak Singh. I mentioned the other books that I read on a similar leitmotif, and I think this is by far the most moving one that I have read. And you've done an amazing job of carrying the sentiment across without being maudlin. And that's extremely difficult to do. So thank you, Navdeep. It's been my pleasure, it's been my privilege, and we all look forward to Aapki Khair. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
To have Mr. Suri with us today. It was such a profound session to know more about you, your journey as an Indian diplomat, and about your books. Sir, kudos to you for allowing us to enjoy the brilliant gems of Punjabi literature through the brilliant translations of your grandfather, Nanak Singh's classic works. Your conversations with Mr. Mohanka illuminated the session because of the rich and sensitive discussions on the turbulent aftermath of partition of 1947, portrayed in the historical narrative of Khoon De Sohile. Am I right in that? Yeah. It carried the stamp of lived tragedy. On behalf of Prabhakrathan Foundation, I would like to express my sincerest gratitude to Mr. Navdeep Suri and conversationalist Mr. Manoj Mohanka. I would like to thank our patron Shree Cement Limited, distinguished associate Taj Bengal, and media partner My Calcutta. An event gets more interesting when there's a receptive audience. Thank you all for attending the event and making it successful and enjoyable. I would now like to request Mr. Mrityunjay Singh to felicitate Mr. Navdeep Suri and Mr. Manoj Mohanka with fascinating mementos from Bengal's Dokra art.
So just hold.
Hymns in Blood photographed by Mr. Suri before you leave.